So this video is going to continue looking at chapter 6 out of your textbook, building on the PowerPoint presentation I've done already looking at supply and demand. So this one we're going to look specifically at market economies. As you can see, this is broken down into three different categories. We have closed economies, free market economies and mixed market economies, and we're looking at each of these briefly in a little bit of detail, and then most of the presentation will focus on mixed market economies. So a closed economy, what is it? Well, basically it is an economy where the country, everything is run, controlled, regulated by the state. So there's no private business. The state owns all the factories, it owns all the methods of production, all the retail, all the shops, all the factories. Everything is owned by the government. And if you think about countries where you go on holiday, these kind of economies are the kind of economies where you're not going to be able to buy the currency in advance of visiting there. Don't know if it's different now, but when I visited Tunisia back in the early 1990s, we had to buy American dollars and then buy the local Tunisian dinar. Once we were in Tunisia, you couldn't buy dinar outside of Tunisia, and you couldn't take the currency out of the country with you. So have a think, and is it anywhere that you've been on holiday where you've not been able to buy the local currency until you actually get there? Also, with a true closed economy, they don't like dealing with people outside of their own country. They don't like dealing with other countries. So they tend to be very insular, very isolated. Again, thinking of examples, the best example I can think of off the top of my head would be somewhere like Tibet, where they totally isolated, totally cut off. Tibet, Nepal, places like that. Although I suspect that's opening up a bit more now than what it used to be. But if we think about a pure closed economy, they are totally isolated, they don't want to interact with anybody else, and the state controls everything and runs everything. So hopefully that's clear, that that's what a closed economy is. Need to understand what that is, but in terms of your studies, I think it's less likely that you would be asked to write about a closed economy, but I want to make sure that you have an understanding of the different types of economies that can exist. So moving on from there to the other extreme, we have a free economy, a free market economy. As it says on the slide, it's the opposite of a closed economy. Where a closed economy, you have the state controlling absolutely everything. In a free market economy, it's the reverse. The state basically believe that if they leave commerce, industry, private industry, to its own devices, they will set the prices, they will control the market themselves, and therefore will regulate themselves as well. So from a free market economy, the state does not intervene, the state does not get involved. So you wouldn't have seen, for example, when the banks hit the crisis in 2008, you wouldn't have seen the state jumping in and intervening and saving banks. That just wouldn't have happened in a free market economy, because the political powers in that kind of environment would believe that the country, the economy, can take care of itself, and therefore the state does not need to intervene. So this is a real kind of capitalist ideal of what capitalism looks like, that they're in total control. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. So we've got one extreme. If you think about a line as a continuum, one end of the line we have a closed economy. At the other end of the line we have the free market economy. Imagine it's a very, very big line, and within those two ranges, within that range, we have mixed market economies. they can appear anywhere along this line. So this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, because we have different types of mixed market economies. But in principle, a mixed market economy is where you have a combination, a mix, as it says here, a combination of allowing businesses to do what they do best, to run their businesses, to manage supply and demand in the marketplace, to set prices, but there are some things that the state will control and will intervene with. Generally speaking, as it says here, the control of the government is established and maintained through things like taxes, laws, regulations, and probably things like competition commission and things like that, where they're looking at how different companies are behaving and what they're doing, and using that information to establish, do we want to intervene, yes or no. An example right now to think about is the proposed merger between Asda and Sainsbury's. If they merge, those two, they are what currently number 2 and number 3 of the supermarkets in the UK. If they merge, it will make them bigger, more market share than Tesco's. Some people are arguing that that's a good thing, because it means that it's giving Tesco some competition, and they have said that they're targeting slightly different markets, so what they offer will remain the same. They won't change an awful lot, but there are some concerns that by reducing the number of supermarkets we have holding a large part of the market share, it's taking away some consumer choice and flexibility. So there is a possibility that the Competition Commission may say no and not allow this merger to take place. So if you thought about a free market economy, Asda and Sainsbury's will be allowed to merge. No intervention, no restrictions, no concern, or rather any concerns there may be would be ignored, because they would believe in a free market economy that those companies know what they're doing and they know what's best for the economy, and perhaps it allows them to compete head on with Tesco's. So that would be a free market. Mixed market is where that may still happen, but the government will look to see how is this going to impact on the country, how is it going to impact on consumers. Is it possible that it may actually take away choice for customers if they allow those two to merge? Does it mean that there's actually going to be less retail outlets, less stores available if you have a Sainsbury's and an Asda fairly close together, competing with each other, bringing down prices? Once those companies are merged, if they were the only two supermarkets in a town, for example, if they merge, is it possible that those two stores might merge, or they may close down one and just keep one open, in which case that would mean that particular store controls that marketplace and there's no competition. So if that's a risk that could happen, state might intervene. So that's kind of where your mixed market economies comes in. The state might intervene, but as I said, looking at how things are done in different countries, there's different variations of what a mixed market economy can look like. So last bullet point here, we have different models of mixed economies, looking at the liberal market economies. So the UK is an example of a liberal market. But we also have coordinated market economies. In your exam, you're likely to be asked for comparisons between the UK liberal market economy and a European coordinated market economy model. So if you're not just asked to write about the UK model or asked to write about mixed markets generally, it's more likely that you're going to be asked to do a comparison between those two. So how does that look? Well, if we think about our continuum again, and we have free market economy at one end, the UK's model's quite high up there, so there's not that much state intervention in the UK model. So although it is still a mixed market economy, it's not a free economy. There are some regulation, but not as much as in the European model, for example. So the European model will be somewhere further down the line, going more towards a closed economy. It's not a closed economy, but it's much more collaborative. The state is much more actively and heavily involved in things than it would be in the UK, for example. So I hope that's all clear. And we're now going to move on a little bit and go into a little bit more depth on all of this. Okay, well, I think I've said that already. So, as I said, Britain is closer to the free market economy, but Europe is has a more socialist focus. It's much more collaborative between the means of production, the means of ownership, so the capitalist side of things, and the power of the workers, how much the workers are involved with things. And the state is also involved, so you might see more state intervention. To some extent, you'll see it, usually France is quite a good example of what you see in the news, where the country are unhappy about something and the unions are striking about a proposed new company coming in and competing with, say, the French car industry, for example. So the state will tend to intervene to try and help protect the French manufacturers, the French companies, whereas that wouldn't happen in Britain to the same extent. So hopefully, if you think about how things work and what we hear about on the news, sometimes it's quite it's perhaps a strong illustration, but it is a good illustration of showing what the differences are between how things happen in the UK and how things happen in France. Okay, so liberal market economies, as I've mentioned already, there is a strong emphasis on competition in the marketplace. So government tends to be more hands-off. They will let the companies, the competition, manage itself, set prices, engage in pricing wars or whatever it is that they want to do. But as a general rule, the state will not intervene unless it thinks there's going to be a negative impact on the economy of the country as a whole. So it's much more, the regulation and the legislation that's involved tends to be more the contract between the buyers and the sellers. So it's much more commercial law rather than the government introducing regulations or whatever. It's a case of, if you're not happy about something, then you can take them to court and deal with it yourself, and you deal with that yourself. It's not you don't look to the government to intervene or act on your behalf. So in a coordinated economy, as I've touched upon already, the relationship is not so much just about the relationship between different companies competing with each other or buyers and sellers of goods and services. Companies will also have closer working relationships with trade unions. They will have closer working relationships with the state. But what you also see sometimes is a tendency towards cooperation even between competitors. So you have much more joint ventures, collaborative projects where companies are working together. I'd obviously mentioned the car industry already, and I can remember reading something fairly recently where one of the French car manufacturers, I think it might have been Renault, are actually collaborating with, I think, one of the Japanese car manufacturers. So rather than fighting them and seeing them as a threat and allowing competition to dictate how things work out, they've approached it and saying, right, well, this is perhaps good, so let's look at how we can manage it, let's look at how we can collaborate to have a greater joint venture basically going forward. So they're all working together rather than in competition with each other. Perhaps one of the side effects of that may be that if the competition, or too many of the competitors are collaborating, perhaps that's a problem with price fixing and things like that. And we see that with things like oil cartels, where the different oil manufacturers, different oil producing countries in the Gulf all work together to set a price for crude oil So it doesn't matter which country you're buying the oil from, they control the supply and they control the prices. And it's not as if you say, well, I don't want to buy from that country because their prices are high, so I'm going to go to another country. They're all working together and they're all collaborating, so we have one price. So if you want your oil, you have to pay. Difference nowadays probably is the fact that they may still all work together to control the prices, but there's a lot of oil coming out of places like Russia as well now, so there's perhaps more competition than there used to be. But that also gives us an example of where collaboration can take place rather than them being in direct competition, and that helping to drive prices down. So that's a brief overview of a liberal economy and a coordinated economy. So now we're going to look more specifically at the UK market, so you've got a better understanding of what that looks like. So the UK market is described as being deindustrialised, post-industrial economy within a globalised market. So breaking that down a little bit, we have less industry now than there used to be. So as it says in the bullet points below, manufacturing only accounts for about 10% of Britain's gross domestic product. So majority of the money that is produced within the UK comes from other things, service sector, and so it's a service sector and probably a knowledge sector. So we're building much more based on the knowledge of people within the country, and doing what we can to retain that knowledge. So deindustrial, post-industrial, so it's kind of what comes after an industrial society. Traditionally, you would have gone from an industrial society to a service sector, a service economy, but that's kind of being taken over a little bit as some of the service centre, call centres and things like that were being outsourced to countries where it's cheaper to run call centres. So it's moved away from being a pure service sector, service economy, to being a knowledge economy where the value of the knowledge of the workforce is seen as being much more important. So what else? I mean the population, don't tend to spend as much of their disposable income on goods. We tend to spend more on services. So whether that's going on holidays, going for a night out, going to the pictures, going for a drink, going for a meal, whatever it is, we're spending much more of our money on those sorts of things rather than the things we need for our home. 3/4 of the workforce are employed in the service sector, and the biggest growing sector in the UK is financial services, but we need to be careful about what might happen with Brexit, how Brexit might influence this. There's already some concerns about what might happen with the financial sector. Will the financial sector stay in the UK when we leave Europe? And some of the service sector as well, it depends what you're looking at. If you're looking at tourism, for example, then obviously that's not going to change. But if you're talking about call centres or those sorts of industries, the possibility is it doesn't really matter where they're based. If it's cheaper for them to be based in Europe, they may leave the UK. So while we do these things, it's difficult to know how it's going to impact on our economy. So something to bear in mind and think about. Okay, so what we're going on to look at in the next video will be monetary and fiscal policy. So we will stop there, and I hope you find this video useful.